This is The Theory of Flight by Siphiwe, Gloria, and Ndlovu, read as part of the prescribed reading for the IEB English Home Language 2022 and 2023 curriculum. This is Book 1, Part 2, History, Marcus and Genie. By the time Marcus and Genie were old enough to understand the world around them, the recent war seemed but a distant memory. For life on the Beaufort farm and estate had taken great pains to become blissful again. Perhaps it was because their country was newly independent, and a country's independence is as infectious and tends to permeate everything. Or perhaps it was because both of them were too young to remember the particular horrors the Civil War has visited upon the compound. Whatever the reason, Marcus and Genie both developed a strong sense of adventure and soon grew tired of the monotonous greyish yellow of the compound. They were eager to explore the world outside, and because the farthest thing their eyes could see were the distant hills that looked like a hazy blue something on the horizon, they wanted to personally touch that hazy blue something. If they had been able to tell the passing of time, they would have known that it took close to 6 months to convince Elizabeth, who remembered only too well the horrors of the Civil War, to let them walk out of the compound down the long dusty road that seemed to stretch on forever, only to lose itself in the distant hills. They never realized that she let them go only because she knew they could not go far. And so it came to pass on a clear day in December, Marcus and Genie left the compound for the first time in their lives. It never occurred to either Marcus or Genie as they set off down the dusty road, armed with only a broken umbrella, a half-eaten packet of lemon creams, and a bottle of water, that they could actually climb the hills. From the stories they heard at night around the compound fire, they knew that what lived on the other side of the hills was terrifyingly wicked and relentlessly evil. They also knew from around the fire's stories that the hills themselves were innocent, and that therefore there was absolutely nothing wrong with touching them and feeling their reassuring permanence. Since they could see the hills, they thought it would not take long to reach them. They probably had not walked as far as they thought. Genie with Penelope, her handmaid rag doll, whose dark brown skin and beautiful dress her mother had made from scraps left over from materials she used to make her dresses for herself and Genie, tied on her back and secured by a towel that was knotted around her waist, carrying a broken umbrella over their heads as Marcus drove his wire car along the dusty road, one trouser pocket stuffed with lemon creams and the other containing the water bottle, when their dusty legs grew tired. As their determination to reach the distant hills rapidly waned, they were more than happy to discover to the left of them a field of yellow that stretched as far as the eye could see. Sunflowers. They had never been told that such a thing of beauty existed. Without hesitation, Genie ran giggling into the field, never stopping to think that it could contain anything harmful or dangerous. Marcus hesitated. He left his wire car on the side of the road in full view of any passers-by, just in case he and Genie got lost in there, disappeared in a sea of yellow, never to be found again. If anyone came to find them, they would know exactly where to look. And if the two of them were never found again, at least people would know exactly what had happened. Marcus was a cautious but not particularly morbid child. He just knew from all the stories told around the compound fire that not all stories had a happy ending, and that horrible things sometimes happened to people, especially curious children who ventured too far away from home. Playing among the sunflowers proved to be a happy distraction from the quest to reach the hazy blue something. Marcus and Genie ran laughing and zigzagging through the stalks, not really sure who was trying to catch whom. And so it was that day after day they left the compound intent on reaching the distant hills, but day after day found themselves playing among the sunflowers. Then one day they gave up the quest altogether and simply made their way straight to the sunflowers. After that, it did not take long for the hazy blue hills in the distance to become a distant memory. When they were not playing Catch Me If You Can, Genie sang songs she had learned from her mother and told stories she had heard around the compound fires to a very appreciative audience of sunflowers. They continued to find pleasure in the sunflowers, even as the petals began to shrivel, the stalks hardened, and the brown faces of the sunflowers became darker and downcast. Then, one day, all laughter died. Just like that. Unable to comprehend, Marcus and Genie stared at all the sunflowers lying on the reddish-brown soil, no longer reaching for the sky. They had all been felled to the ground, every single one. Genie desperately tried to get them standing again, and Marcus had no choice but to help her. With their hands, they dug the reddish-brown soil and reinstated the stalks to their rightful places. Some stood, but most fell down again. Genie was determined. She didn't care how long it would take. All she told herself was that one day all the sunflowers would be replanted. But when they arrived the next morning, the scene was worse than they could have imagined. The sunflowers were gone, all of them, even the ones they had put upright again. There was not a trace, not a forlorn green stalk, not a withered yellow petal, not an abandoned brownish black seed, no evidence at all that this had recently been a populated sunflower field. The barren scene truly broke Genie's heart, and for the first time in her life she turned her face away from the sun. Wordlessly, Genie sank into the reddish-brown soil and cried silent tears for the first time in her short life. Marcus put his arm around her, but at that moment became old enough to know that Genie's grief was something he could not console away. He was sad, not for himself, but for Genie, because although he understood that this was a loss, he knew that this loss was mostly hers. She had loved the sunflowers in a way that he had not. She had loved them deeply. He had not. She had loved them with every fiber of her being. He had not. In truth, he had loved the sunflowers only because Genie loved them. He saw that they were beautiful, but were it not for Genie, he would not have seen that theirs was a beauty worth cherishing. On that day, Marcus made another discovery. It was the discovery he could only have made because of the sunflower's disappearance. As Genie planted her feet in the reddish-brown soil and sifted it through her fingers in a vain effort to find something that remained, a glint on the horizon caught Marcus's eye. In the early morning sunlight, he made out the carcass of a car. The abandoned car had been there all along, lonely as it listened to them play and laugh in the field, lonely as it listened to Genie sing and tell stories to the sunflowers, lonely as it watched them walk away without being discovered. The loneliness of the abandoned car filled Marcus with a sadness that made him want to run towards it without hesitation and touch it. It was only Genie's grief that stopped him from doing so. In a show of solidarity, he too sifted the soil through his fingers, but he could not bring himself to bury his feet in the reddish-brown soil. Every now and then his eyes stole looks at the abandoned car. Perhaps the biggest challenge that now presented itself in young Marcus's life was how to tell Genie about the abandoned car. Every day, secretly, he visited the car, a Morris Mini Minor that he christened Brown Car for more its rusty patches than for its original beige color. He found time for these secret visits in those moments when Elizabeth found it necessary to have her daughter close to her. When she washed their clothes and hung them to dry, when she cooked their meals, when she combed and plaited their hair, when she dressed them both in bright, colorful clothes, when she wanted someone to sing to or sing with, or when she simply wanted to have her daughter close so that she could pick her up whenever she felt like it, and twirl her in the air, and hug her fiercely, and pepper her skin with kisses, and listen to Genie giggle and giggle as though she knew no end to life. Before they discovered the sunflower field and before he discovered Brown Car, Marcus's favorite time of day had been bath time. Not his bath time, which consisted of his grandmother religiously scrubbing his body with a coarse face cloth and harsh soap that was sudsy enough but stung his eyes and prickled his nose and made him sneeze repeatedly as his grandmother told him about the dangers of dirt and vanity while he stood in a zinc galvanized steel bucket which was filled with just enough cold water to make him clean. No, not that bath time, but Genie and Elizabeth's. They bathed together, and their bath time was filled with laughter and giggles and songs and warm water splishing and splashing in their enamel cast iron tub, the warm and comforting scent of vanilla wafting out of the window of their bedroom, under which Marcus stoically sat, even though the other boys in the compound teased him mercilessly for doing so. From under the window, Marcus could hear the conversations they had. "Ma, when I grow up, will I have big breasts as yours?" "Would you like to have breasts as big as mine?" "Yes, most definitely." "Then you shall." "Ma, when I grow up, will I have a bottom as round as yours?" "Would you like to have a bottom as round as mine?" "Yes, maybe even rounder." "Then you shall," replied a laughing voice. "Ma, when I grow up, will I be as beautiful as you?" "No, you'll be much more beautiful than me. You'll be a true sight to behold." "But I don't want to be more beautiful than you." "Then you'll have to try very hard not to be." "Ma, I know that I came from somewhere in your heart." "Yes, you did." "And that I was an egg." "A golden egg." "Does that mean—" "Marcus says that means I don't have a father." "Marcus knows as much as Marcus can know." "Do I have a father?" "It depends." "On what?" "On the future." Marcus had fallen asleep many a time under that open window, lulled by the warm vanilla scent, their soothing voices, generous laughter, and genuine happiness. But after he discovered brown car, he no longer spent time under the high window. He spent his time breathing in the surprisingly comforting smell of rusting metal and rotting seat cushioning. It was an old and somewhat familiar smell, his fingers reveling in the curse of the steering wheel. Marcus imagined himself driving down the long, dusty road away from the compound and towards the hazy blue hills, always with Genie by his side in the passenger seat and her beloved Penelope in the back. Marcus did all the driving because, from what he had seen on the compound, only men drove vehicles. It had never occurred to him that his imagination did not have to be bound by the reality of the compound. As he fantasized about these journeys to and from the compound, he tried to devise a plan to tell Genie about his new love, brown car. As it turned out, he didn't have to. One day, as he imagined himself driving down the dirt road with Genie by his side, he smelled the warm scent of vanilla and wood smoke and turned to see Genie looking at him from the passenger seat, a rare frown creasing her brow, her arms crossed and resting on her slightly distended belly. "So this is it," she said, looking over the interior of brown car with no hint of the admiration he felt when he looked at the car. "This is what made you steal away from me." What was he supposed to say to that? The ever-present Penelope also seemed to give him a disapproving look from her secure position on Genie's back. He felt his heart sink. And then Genie's face broke into a smile, the gap between her two front teeth making him smile too, as it always did. And from then on, that was how they spent most of their mornings and afternoons, slowly baking in brown car's carcass, together traveling to the places contained within their imaginations. Places they had heard of: China, Egypt, England, the Soviet Union, and America. In their imaginations, the places all looked exactly like the compound, except China had a great wall running around it. Egypt had pyramids and sphinxes where the schoolrooms were. England had a stuffy and stiff queen, looking very out of place in the greyish-yellow dust of the compound as she walked around in her bejewelled crown and heavy red cloak, looking for someone called Margaret Thatcher, but never finding her. The Soviet Union had the word communism, or rather, as Marcus and Genie spelled it, communism, plastered on every building in the compound in big red letters. America contained Marcus's parents, who manifested themselves as younger versions of Marcus's grandmother and grandfather, the way they looked in their wedding photo: Christian, proper, and unsmiling. The America that Marcus's parents lived in was filled with men riding horses and wearing Stetsons, and men driving fast cars and wearing fedoras. In other words, they lived in the America seen in the bioscope. During their many travels, Marcus and Genie even visited Genie's father, Golide Gumede, in the future. It was Genie's idea to borrow the World Atlas from Marcus's grandfather's scant library so that they would have more places to visit. Unfortunately, it had been printed in 1965 and did not contain the name of their newly independent country. The World Atlas therefore presented them with more possibilities as well as more challenges. Their newly independent country could have been any of those land masses surrounded by even larger masses of water. It could have been one of those teeny tiny shapes that seemed to be in grave danger of being swallowed whole by the masses of water. As a result, their newly independent country sometimes found itself in the center of the world map, sometimes in the north, sometimes in the south, sometimes in the east, and sometimes in the west. Marcus and Genie already understood that the world had a fluidity to it, even if they did not as yet understand their place in it. Worlds and possibilities unfurled before them, creating dizzying delights. So engrossed were they in their world travels that it took them a while to notice that shoots were beginning to rise out of the reddish-brown earth. The sunflowers were being reborn. This was how they learned their most valuable lesson about death: that after it there was life again, that new things that perish will rise again, that after every ending there is another beginning. And so, although they spent the days and afternoons traveling the globes, their eyes also patiently watched the sunflowers grow stronger as they reached towards the sun. They watched as the leaves appeared. They watched as a million blooms burst in unison. They watched as a million brown faces turned towards the sun, and Genie chose that exact moment to take her rightful place among them, welcoming the familiar itch of her skin as her arms came into contact with the stalks, and enjoying the cool dampness of the reddish-brown soil as her toes burrowed in, rooting her in her place. It was one day, while they were in the sunflower field, that their first truly strange thing happened. Through the stalks they saw a car sputter to a stop. 2 men were inside. Neither of them got out. The driver simply rolled down his window and proceeded to smoke a cigarette, blowing smoke rings out of the open window as though he had all the time in the world. From their vantage point within the sunflowers, Marcus and Genie could see of the men to know that they did not know them. They did not belong to the Beaufort farm and estate. After the war, strangers had been very rare on the Beaufort farm and estate. Even so, Marcus knew enough about strangers to hold on fast to Genie's hand. Genie, who had a tendency to run towards everything without hesitation. They stood among the stalks for a minute, holding hands, not moving, afraid to breathe. Then the man in the passenger seat got out and walked towards them. Marcus and Genie held a collective breath, fearing something, though not really sure what. The man stopped right at the edge of the sunflower field and started unzipping his trousers. It was then that Marcus risked everything and moved. He lifted the hand that was not clutching Genie's hand and used it to cover her eyes. He shut his own. They heard the man's urine splash onto the reddish-brown soil. It was only when they heard the car door slam shut that Marcus removed his hand from Genie's eyes and opened his own. They felt too embarrassed to look at each other. Not looking at each other is what allowed them to witness the astonishing thing that happened next. Just as the coolness in the air and the changing color of the light through the sunflower petals was letting them know that the sun was beginning to set, the boot of the car popped open and out of it slowly unfolded an impossibly tall man, like a jack-in-a-box that was taking its time to surprise them. This time, Marcus and Genie held their collective breath in sheer awe. The driver and the passenger got out of the car and joined the third man. They had long, whispered conversations before they shook hands, grasping each other's arms within their free hands, a sure sign of something deeply felt. Without even having to say anything to each other, Marcus and Genie knew that they would be greeting each other like that from then on. The driver and the passenger got back in the car, which came alive without a sputter. It made a quick U-turn and raised a lot of dust in the air, so much that Marcus and Genie had to strain to see what was happening. The driver said something to the third man that he responded to with a smile. Then all three men brought their right hands towards their forehead at a very sharp angle. Then just as suddenly and just as simultaneously, they brought their hands down in a sharp motion. Goodbye. Without even having to say anything to each other, Marcus and Genie knew that they would be saying goodbye to each other just like that from then on too. The car slowly drove away. The third man remained in the cloud of dust, but started to turn towards the compound. His eyes quickly swept over the sunflowers. Then he stopped. Genie immediately let go of Marcus's hand and ran towards the man. They seemed to share a mutual elation at having discovered one another. The man threw Genie's arms into the air. Marcus was terrified. The man caught Genie with a smile. It was only when he saw the gap between the man's two front teeth that Marcus felt safe enough to leave the sunflower field. When the man shifted his smiling eyes from Genie to Marcus, Marcus was grateful to see that they did not lose any of their warmth. He basked in the warm glow of their welcome as he shyly, and in a manly way, or so he hoped, shook the man's hand. All three of them were so wrapped up in getting acquainted that they did not notice Elizabeth hurtling towards them with the speed and ferocity of a mother elephant that knows its calf is in danger. Dust rose in her wake as the many colors of her dress seemed determined to fly over her body. The blonde hair that so often sat on top of her head had long flown off and been trampled by some of the other residents of the compound who were following her. Sensing instinctively that something either spectacularly tragic was happening that they would need to bear witness. Golide, Elizabeth bellowed before coming to an abrupt stop. Her eyes were wide with wonder, confusion, relief, joy, and pain. Her body trembled with the force of feeling all those emotions at once. Justina strategically started ululating. Relieved to finally have something to do, the compound residents celebrated. The woman ululated and danced a jig. The men did a very elaborate warrior dance, kicking their legs high into the air, humming and chanting a warrior song deep in their throats. The younger members of the compound did not do the jig or the warrior dance. They were too modern for that. They chose instead to do the twist, and the really gifted among them even braved the mapansula. No one, not a single person, minded all the dust that the joy of the occasion raised as they made their way back towards the compound. Golide seemed at once both touched and embarrassed by the attention. However, this spontaneous excess of sheer joy was not unwarranted. For Golide Gumede, Liberation War hero, had returned home alive and well, unlike so many others who had returned broken or had not returned at all. The presence of life after the death and devastation of war was definitely something worth celebrating. Marcus had never before felt such a deep sense of belonging as when he walked nestled between Elizabeth and Golide, each of his hands in one of theirs. He smiled up at Genie, and she smiled down at him from where she sat, perched resplendently on her father's shoulders. This was the happiest day of their young lives. It was while they were in Brown Car that the second truly strange thing happened. A few years had passed since Genie's father's return. Things all around had changed. There was more traffic along the dirt road. A mobile library came once a month, allowing residents of the compound to borrow one book each. Marcus borrowed a different volume of The Adventures of Tintin every month. Genie borrowed The Firebird and renewed it every month. Marcus enjoyed challenging his lips and tongue with Captain Haddock's alliteration-obsessed diatribes, and Genie was enamored of the pretty pictures of the beautifully colored bird, as well as the story of how it remained elusive for Prince Ivan and sent him on a tremendous quest. In addition to the mobile library, A mobile clinic came once a week. A Mackenzie bus came twice a week from the city, resuming the schedule that had been suspended during the Liberation War. Within Brown Car, things had also changed. Penelope had been joined by Specs, a teddy bear who wore glasses that had been a Christmas present to Genie from her father. Penelope left the permanent security of Genie's back to be with Specs on the back seat. The death and resurrection of the sunflowers were now things that Marcus and Genie were accustomed to. So they were content to look on miles and miles of barren reddish-brown soil. They felt so secure in their happiness that when the second strange thing happened, it took them a while to realize that it was actually a threat to that happiness. A flashy car drove up the dirt road at a very high speed, which was strange enough in and of itself, because most vehicles had the good sense to travel slowly and carefully on the dirt road, knowing it was highly unpredictable and never to be trusted. The car whizzed by so fast that there was no way Marcus and Genie could tell who or what it was in it. Truth be told, they didn't particularly care to know. A few minutes after it had disappeared, they ceased to think about it altogether. Sometime later, the imprudently fast car made its way back down the dirt road. This time, though, it seemed to have learned its lesson and proceeded slowly and with caution. Marcus and Genie were surprised when everyone they loved, Genie's parents and Marcus's grandparents, alighted from the back of the car. From the front, two people alighted, a man and a woman who looked too shiny. Their clothes were shimmery. Their skin, unburnt by the sun, looked burnished. Their too long hair, both his and hers, was glossy and incongruously curly as it glinted in the sun. Marcus was at first embarrassed for them. Then he immediately felt guilty for being embarrassed, because he knew without being told that these were his parents, fresh from America. The woman, he supposed he had to think of her as his mother now, came rushing towards him, arms outstretched, yelling, "Honey!" Marcus got out of Brown Car, hesitantly, cautiously, reluctantly. Genie understood his apprehension, so she got out of Brown Car with him and held his hand. The woman, his mother, frowned at Genie before hugging Marcus. "You're just as beautiful as I knew you would be," she said, covering his face with kisses. She smelled of something so sweet that it made Marcus and Genie sneeze at the same time. "Aren't you precious?" the woman said, looking at Genie and smiling a smile that did not reach her eyes or remove the frown from her forehead. "Yes, I am precious," Genie replied matter-of-factly, which only deepened the woman's frown. "Is her name Precious?" the woman asked no one in particular as she finally stood up and smoothed her shiny appearance. "My name is Genie." "Oh, how precious." The man, Marcus supposed he had to think of him as his father now, came forward but seemed not to know what to do next. Marcus strongly suspected the man, his father, felt foolish, looking so shiny next to his grandfather and Genie's father, who looked like real men. "Oh, Dee, you are helpless. You both are," the woman said, laughing and pushing the man towards Marcus. Finally, the man, his father, Dee, offered Marcus a hand, and Marcus and he shook hands. "Oh," the woman squealed. "I wish we had brought a camera. We should have thought of it," she squealed some more. "Oh, this is just too precious," she said, clasping her hands together in sheer delight. "We have a surprise for you in the car," she announced, reaching out her hand to Marcus. When he took her hand hesitantly, she lifted him up with such surprising force that he had to let go of Genie. Without warning, his mother started walking rather quickly towards the flashy car and away from Genie. Marcus looked at Genie over his mother's shoulder as the distance between them grew at an alarming rate. Even though his grandparents and Genie's parents were there, he felt that he was in danger and that something horrible was happening. "Genie!" he all but screamed. She ran after him, shouting, "Marcus!" The worry in her voice matched the fear in his. "Perhaps there's another way to do this," Golide was saying. "Surely you see how very attached they are to each other," Elizabeth added. "I'm sorry." the woman, his mother, said, holding him tighter. "It's not our intention to be cruel, but you all know what's going on. It's no longer safe here." "It never was safe, but we survived. We've always survived," his grandmother said. Marcus turned to look at her. Her voice had sounded hard, but there was a tenderness in her moist eyes, which were fixed on Marcus. His grandmother had never looked at him like that before. His grandmother had never cried in his presence before. It was when he looked at his grandmother that the reality of what was happening to him became clear. The surprise in the car was simply a ruse. The woman and this man, his mother, and his father, his parents, were here to take him away. Suddenly feeling trapped by his mother's arms, Marcus struggled to release himself, kicking his feet and flailing his arms. He knew he was hurting her. Perhaps he even meant to hurt her. But his mother's hold on him only got stronger. He dug his fingernails as deep as he could into her neck and then dragged them. She let out a startled, sharp cry of pain, but still did not let him go. "You'll thank us for this one day," she said. Marcus seriously doubted it. Since he had no intention of leaving the Beaufort farm and estate, he grabbed hold of one of her loop earrings and pulled as hard as he could. As the earring ripped through her earlobe, Marcus felt her warm blood ooze into his hand. His father opened the passenger door to the imprudent car. It was then that Marcus sank his teeth into his mother's cheek, but it was already too late. She was already sitting in the car and hugging him to her body. He heard the door lock after his father banged it shut. He saw Genie reach the door and try its handle before her own mother swept her up, saying, "Let him go. You have to let him go." It was then that he saw something into Genie's eyes as she looked at him. It made him give up the fight entirely. Everything became a blur. "I'm sure in time we'll be able to put all of this behind us," his father said, getting into the car. Marcus could not tell whether he was saying this to the people in the car or to the people outside. Marcus blinked away the tears in time to see Genie give him a smile. He knew it was not a genuine smile. It was a smile meant to give him courage. He did not want someone to give him courage. He wanted someone to save him, and then Genie did the unthinkable. She raised her hand in a sharp angle and brought it to her forehead. "Goodbye." She waited for him to do the same, but he absolutely refused to say goodbye. Suddenly there was dust all over the car as the car sped away, and then Marcus could no longer see the sunflower field. He wondered for a long time afterwards if Genie, believing he had returned her salute, had completed the gesture by bringing her hand sharply down. Had she really said goodbye to him and let him go forever? Just like that? Or was she still waiting, her right hand at a sharp angle to her forehead? In the car, his mother pressed her cheek to the top of his head and rocked him gently. "You'll see. You'll thank us for saving you. You'll thank us someday." She repeated the words over and over again as though she was reciting a lullaby. His eyes grew heavy. His body was tired from the fight. It was only as his eyes struggled to stay open that he noticed the other woman in the car, an older woman, and in her arms she held a sleeping child, a girl who seemed encased in frilly pink. "That's our surprise," his father's voice said. "She's your little sister, and her name is Crystal." Marcus looked at his father, who smiled at him, obviously happy about something. He looked back at the unsmiling older woman holding the girl. "That's your grandmother, my mother." "We are your family now," his new grandmother said, still not smiling. They all looked beautiful, the members of his family, but Marcus felt that their beauty was not to be trusted. It was a dangerous beauty. He was suddenly more terrified than he had ever been before. He let go of his bladder then, well aware that his urine would soil both his shorts and his mother's shiny dress.